Okay, so my name's Jim Steele. I'm from from Australia, from the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, CSIRO. We're here with branding. And I'm going to talk about some work that we've been doing with REDCap and FHIR. So just as a bit of context, so CSIRO is Australia's national research agency, so we cover a huge variety of research from boats that are down in Antarctica sampling ice to e-health. And the e-health part is the Australian E-Health Research Centre, which is the centre that I'm a part of. And we have a whole bunch of FHIR activities that we're going on. Some of you might have heard about FHIR Terminology Server, Onto Server. And we have some tools, Shrimp and Snapper, for browsing terminology as well. The National Clinical Terminology Service is the major rollout of that terminology work that my colleague John spoke about earlier in the week within Australia. Onto Server is also being used in other places. We're also doing work on analytics with FHIR and terminologies like SNOMED CT. We're doing some Smart on FHIR work for things like genomic test ordering, medical image analysis, case-based learning for medical students. And we're just starting some work on FHIR profiling for primary care. So we're doing a lot of FHIR work, and the things I'm going to talk about today are kind of the efforts that happened because the FHIR terminology people in our lab, myself included, started hassling some of the people who are involved in clinical trials to be using FHIR, or at least being aware of FHIR and what it can do for them in the data capture that they do as part of their clinical trials. So the specific tool that we started doing this with is REDCap. So are people familiar with REDCap at all? A few. So it's a tool for experimental data capture. Some similarities, I think, to tools like Cantor, which was presented earlier in the week, to ODK, to OpenClinica. So it's questionnaire type systems for gathering data during research and experiments. It has an online designer for the forms that get filled out during these projects. That allows the user, typically a clinician, to capture either free text data or, if at all possible, then structured data as well. And then to manage that data once they've captured it. So REDCap stores it so it can then be analysed later on. So there's a little bit of existing support in REDCap for structured data capture, mostly through BioPortal. So BioPortal exposes a number of ontologies, and it's possible to say for this question the answer must come from one of the BioPortal ontologies. But there are some limitations. It tends to be the whole ontology. You're not allowed to curate and say, I just want this particular part of the ontology. So you've got less control over the content of the ontologies that you're querying. It only has the international version of SNOMED CT, which is very limiting for us in Australia. In particular, it has no, you can't narrow it down to specific ref sets inside SNOMED CT, and you can't mix code systems, which became an issue in a couple of projects we're involved in. So to deal with this, we have built a module that plugs into REDCap. It's an external module that is, or actually will soon be, hopefully, in the public module registry. That allows you to configure REDCap to point to a FHIR terminology server, and then when you're designing your online questionnaire, you can link a form element to either a FHIR value set, a FHIR code system, which has an implicit value set of all codes, to a SNOMED CT ref set, to a SNOMED CT like sub-hierarchy, or to a LOINC answer list. And then when the clinician's filling out the form, they can select from whichever of those value sets the form element has been linked to using a type ahead autocomplete kind of interface. That usually kicks in after they've typed 2 characters, I think is the current configuration. We're currently using this in 5 studies. 4 of them are active, the other one's about to start. Mostly for the moment using medications. So in Australia, medications come from the Australian medications terminology, which is part of SNOMED CT Australian extension. Which is one of the reasons we needed this. And we have more trials sort of in the pipeline, including some genomics trials that use mixtures of HPO, the human phenotype ontology, and SNOMED CT, which is why we need those mixed value sets, so with values from multiple code systems. So a screenshot of that. So this is the form designer, where when you're configuring an element, you can specify that it comes from a FHIR ontology, and you can search for value sets in any of those 5 categories that I mentioned which allows you to both look up terminology resources that are already in a terminology server, or you can create your own value sets, post them in your terminology server, and then they're available for your REDCap questionnaire, which gives you a lot more control over what values you're selecting from. So that's one piece of work that we did with our REDCap people. The other one we've done is in some of our work, particularly in the genomics space, we want to get the data out of REDCap into a FHIR form. And part of the reason for this is to try and encourage the people who are consuming that data downstream to start using FHIR so that they're more ready to connect to real clinical systems. Rather than using sort of ad hoc structures to store their data, we want them to be using FHIR. So what we've built is a language for describing mappings between data stored in REDCap and FHIR data structures. So it's a declarative mapping language where you describe each form element in REDCap and how that maps across to a FHIR resource. And this allows us to essentially automatically migrate all of that data out of a REDCap in a study across to FHIR resources for downstream processing later in those projects. It's also capable of propagating changes, so you can run it once and get your FHIR resources, and then if you have changes either to the REDCap data or to the metadata in REDCap, or to the mapping rules, or to the rule definitions, or to the mappings, then you can rerun the transformation, and it will propagate changes across to those resources as updates. So we're using this mostly in genomics through the Australian Genomic Health Alliance. We have 8 projects for various reasons. They're all in the same REDCap project, and to deal with that, we've had to put a discriminator operator in the mapping language to say only map these things if they're from this part of the project. So there's a couple of little situational things that have had to be in the language. And at the moment, Variant Atlas is the only downstream tool that's consuming the FHIR resources, but we have hopes that that will be more as the work progresses. And that mapping language and its use is described in a paper that's going to the AMIA Informatics Summit next year. So that's our work, and I'll just have a quick acknowledgement. Although I had some early involvement in this work, a lot of the real work was done by Hugo Leroux, Alejandro Metca Jimenez, and Dave Conlon. So thank you very much for their work. So if there's any time for one question, if not, thank you very much.